I can think of a handful of media-related things that stuck with me from 2013. Bioshock Infinite was rocking everyone's socks off, but now people don't like that game as much anymore, apparently. I never played it. Everybody thought The Last of Us was the best game ever made. And the Xbox One could play TV on your TV, and I remember that being really funny. But when it comes to relevance, Frozen was the thing that had the biggest footprint, I think. It was one of the top-grossing movies in 2013, it had a longer theater run than any other movie in my lifetime, and I couldn't escape two songs in particular. Frozen was so popular I dug my feet in the ground and refused to go see it for months. I was a mature 15-year-old and wanted to get back at the people who liked Frozen by not watching it because I was too old to enjoy this silly, childish garbage. I had airtight reasoning at 15. It wasn't until March of the next year that I went to see Frozen and was slapped in the face with how much I liked it. Today, Frozen is far from being my favorite animated Disney movie. I really enjoy the soundtrack and animation, and the story and characters are solid enough too, but a couple of the songs really mess with the pacing quite a bit, and it makes the back half of the film drag. But you know, I wouldn't say all that popularity was necessarily unwarranted. I totally get why people went absolutely feral over this movie. It felt like a classic Disney story that modernized and reformatted to fit what audiences were looking for in the early 2010s. Then Frozen 2 came out in 2019, and no one really talks about it in 2021 because it's not very good. It's not the worst of the animated Disney canon. There are a couple of aspects about it that are actually quite impressive. But while that might be true, there's just so much about Frozen 2 that does not work that by the time the credits start to roll, you're left with the feeling that Frozen 2 could have, been less shitty? The first film is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I don't think it's unreasonable to wonder if its sequel could have been fairly good as well, or at the very least, narratively sound. I'm getting ahead of myself though, so before I throw myself headfirst down this extremely specific rabbit hole, I just want to say I think it's fine if you like Frozen 2. And just because I don't like it doesn't mean you're not allowed to. The title of this video is inflammatory on purpose because I think it sounds funny, and I'm not making this with the goal of undermining anyone's experience with the film. I would just like to consider the parts of it that could have been improved. So with that being said, I think it would only be fair to first discuss the stuff about Frozen 2 I not only like, but think is an improvement over the first Frozen. One of the weaker parts about the original movie was its insistence to lean a chunk of its humor on the fact that it was talking about the "you're marrying a man you just met" thing.
You got engaged to someone you just met that day?
Yeah, I guess it's funny at first, but they really rest on their laurels with it. The sequel not having this problem is nice, because the genuinely funny scenes are able to stand out better when they're not juxtaposed against repetitive meta-humor. Like the exchange between Anna and Kristoff when they first get to the Enchanted Woods, and Kristoff wants to propose but he accidentally starts talking about death instead. This is such a good scene. The animation is excellent too, and I know how sometimes it's easy to be cynical about Disney's modern animation in the sense of of course it's good looking, it's Disney and they have infinite money kind of way. But this movie is so pretty. I love how it manages to toe the line between its stylized characters and almost photorealistic environment without dipping into the uncanny valley. Really, I have a difficult time disliking Frozen 2 because it's just so beautiful to look at. A lot of the songs are great too. I don't love all of them, but I can't get enough of Some Things Never Change and Show Yourself. I would be bold-facedly lying if I said they didn't evoke some kind of emotional reaction from me, and you'll never get me to dislike Lost in the Woods with its 80s music video vibes. It's cute, and mad props to Jonathan Groff for voicing all of the reindeer at the end and harmonizing with them. I liked that a lot. But now that we're finished with the best stuff, let's get down to business.
You can't just follow me into fire.
Consideration for a Frozen sequel began around as early as 2014, and one of the largest motivators for creating it from director Jennifer Lee was that there was just more to explore with the universe. One of the more popular takes that I see go around when it comes to Frozen 2 is that it's just a lazy cash grab, and I guess I understand this perspective if you look at it from the corporate side of things. If you make a movie and it ends up doing record numbers at the box office, it stands to reason that making a sequel to it is advantageous, if not inevitable. So, sure. But while I agree that the very existence of a Frozen sequel is a little cash grabby, I wouldn't so much agree that it's lazy. Because from the creative side of things, this wasn't really a cash grab. The people behind Frozen 2 had ideas that they thought would add to the world that they had made, and this is true in the final product. One of the defining aspects of Frozen 2 that sets it apart from the original film is how much stuff there is in it. In fact, Frozen 2 has so many ideas that it kind of works to the film's detriment. Because instead of creating a simpler narrative with a couple of twists, the sequel is now tasked with re-establishing the setting and characters, doing world building, introducing new characters, giving the old cast stuff to do that builds on their development in the first movie, and making sure it flows together with the plot they come up with, all within an almost identical running time. This is a challenge a lot of sequels struggle with. The line of re-establishing your universe and creating new things is difficult to walk, and if you add too much new stuff, you run the risk of losing narrative coherence or making elements of your story feel inconsequential, even if you don't intend for them to be. And as you watch Frozen 2, multiple things sure do end up feeling inconsequential by the end. Luckily, my problems mount as the story goes on, so let's start from the beginning. Anna and Elsa are told a bedtime story by their parents about how their father, Agnar, became king, which involved their grandfather, Runerd, and his soldiers becoming friends with an indigenous tribe that lived in the Enchanted Forest, named the Northuldrans, by way of a big dam. The Northuldrans are super in touch with the 4 magical elements, by the way. Everything seems to be going smoothly until both sides start fighting for some reason, Runerd is killed, Agnar is knocked unconscious but is saved, and a large impenetrable fog fades over the Northuldrans' Enchanted Forest. Then Iduna sings the girls a foreboding lullaby which will become relevant later.
But not too far or you'll be drowned.
Cut to modern day, it's autumn, everyone's going about their lives, Kristoff is getting ready to propose, and Elsa starts hearing a voice which causes her to accidentally wake the 4 elemental spirits up. They make a bit of a mess around town, and everyone evacuates to the cliffs above the kingdom. Kristoff's troll family then shows up, and Pobby says that the spirits are angry because of a wrong that must be righted. Then he says this:
We have always feared Elsa's powers were too much for this world. Now we must pray they are enough.
And here is where the problems begin. This inciting incident implies that the 4 elemental spirits waking up pose some sort of existential danger to Arendelle, but that's not communicated very well. Like, we see that the waterfalls stop, the winds pick up for a little bit, the lights go out, there's one earthquake, and then everything calms down and the spirits don't pose any more danger until about 10 minutes later when the gang has already had a lax journey to the Enchanted Forest and have been poking around for a little bit. Compare this to the first movie, where we periodically saw that Arendelle was slowly freezing over, which heightened the tension.
It's completely frozen.
We saw how everything freezing over affected the North Mountain and the people who were on it. This is a microcosm of a problem that persists with most aspects of Frozen 2's story and characters. Something is set up or alluded to, and the film either fails to expand upon it or executes it terribly. While we're on about the 4 elemental spirits, let's discuss how the story has trouble using them. So the cast goes to the Enchanted Woods so Elsa can figure out what the voice she's been hearing is, and also to right a past wrong as instructed by Kristoff's troll dad. Anna finds the peace offering dam from her parents' bedtime story, and then the wind spirit shows up to cause trouble, Elsa tames it quickly, and Anna is mad that the situation was potentially dangerous. This scenario repeats in different permutations as the story continues. So the problem with the spirits is that they are angry because of a wrong that must be righted, but the danger they potentially bring to the setting and characters is incredibly poorly defined. Again, to compare to the first Frozen, the ticking clock of Arendelle freezing not only heightened the tension, it was also one of the things that provided conflict for Anna and Elsa in addition to their fraught upbringings, and it was important for creating a situation for Anna to become a second, more personal ticking clock for the rest of the main cast. Freezing the North Mountain is what creates a believable scenario for Anna to lose her horse at the beginning of Act 2, which provided an in for her to need Kristoff's help and for Hans to hunt Elsa down. Now, Arendelle didn't necessarily need to become a ticking clock here too, but because of how quickly Elsa is able to end spirit-related conflict, and with how poorly the danger they bring is defined, it just doesn't read very well that these things are potential threats like Pobby says. Like, maybe the fire spirit could have already burned a significant number of trees before the gang arrived, or there could have been giant boulders scattered about from the earth giants, or anything to legitimize the danger of this journey just a bit more. This also means that the poorly communicated spirit danger weakens the sisterly conflict. Like, why are you so mad, Anna? We don't really have a grip on how dangerous these things are, and that this encounter was over in like 90 seconds suggests that they kind of aren't. The sequence with the knock is the only good one of these. It tries to stop Elsa from crossing the Dark Sea, which is linked to a personal and well-executed plot beat where the danger of the journey was properly communicated. But by and large, the spirit's illustration as obstacles is just kind of sloppy. The stakes they create are largely undefined, and as a result, the character conflict they create is weak and unconvincing. I'd like to discuss the main characters that aren't the sisters for a bit, but first we have to get back to the synopsis. Elsa taming the wind spirit causes a frozen statue of the sisters' young father and a Northuldra woman the group doesn't recognize to show up. Olaf explains the statue's existence by saying that water has memory, so it follows that Elsa can create literal freeze frames of the past if she's in the right place. The gang then runs into the Northuldra people, led by a woman named Yelena, and Runard's army, led by a man named Lieutenant Matthias, who have been stuck in the enchanted forest and at each other's throats since the impenetrable fog first appeared. The fire spirit then comes along, is quickly tamed, and points the group north. Anna puts on her mother's scarf after having her second argument with Elsa, and the Northuldra people recognize it as a scarf from one of their old families. Elsa and Anna cross-reference the frozen statue from earlier, see that the woman in it has the same scarf, and realize that they are part Northuldra. This causes the tension between the Northuldra people and the Arendalian soldiers to ease for the rest of the movie. At the Northuldra camp, Elsa learns from a girl named Honeymaren about the fifth spirit, which acts as a bridge between the four elements and the Northuldra people. Anna gets advice from Lieutenant Matthias to do the next right thing if times get tough. The Earth Giant shows up, leaves after everyone hides, the sisters have their third argument, and continue north to the Dark Sea with Olaf. Did you notice that I forgot a character in this synopsis? Let's talk about Kristoff. Interspersed throughout the story up to this point, there are short comedic conversations where Kristoff tries and fails to propose to Anna. After the sisters and Olaf continue past the camp, Kristoff and another Northuldra character named Ryder set up a big proposal that does not work. The Northuldra people move their camp, Kristoff has his emotional 80s power ballad, and he and his plotline disappear for most of the rest of the story. So yeah, there are a couple of problems with this. First, similar to the problem with Elsa and Anna's dynamic mentioned earlier, the idea of Anna and Kristoff growing apart is incongruent with its application in the story. Upon its use, it's based on a wordless misunderstanding and a couple of small tiffs. The couple haven't actually had a significant falling out, so the line
Just left without saying anything?
doesn't work because the story hasn't actually put in the work of creating meaningful friction between these two characters. Second, this decision means that one of the main characters' arcs doesn't really resolve at the end of the movie by way of a natural conclusion. Kristoff's relationship anxiety is brought up in the first half of the story, and is then dropped until the conclusion where after he shows up for the climax, he quickly gives a successful proposal in the falling action, and the audience is left to assume that he worked through his anxieties off-screen. Third, Kristoff just shows up for the climax. Not only is he not with the Northuldrans, he hasn't been around for the second half of the movie, so it would follow that he has no idea what's happening. This means that he's less of a character here and more of a plot device to get the story to where it needs to be. And fourth, a big part of what's supposed to sell Anna's lowest point at the end of Act 2 is that she has lost everyone. Elsa and Olaf are dead, but that moment of isolation is not as strong as it could have been because Kristoff is not dead, presumed to have died, or even properly fallen out with. He's just, wandering around somewhere. This means that
Just left without saying anything?
is doing an inordinate amount of work because Kristoff evaporating from the second half of the movie is now supposed to have similar narrative weight to the deaths of two other main characters, and it just isn't good because not 3 minutes after Anna's big emotional number, she just finds Kristoff wandering around the forest because we need to get Anna from point A to point B really quickly to resolve the main tension, and I'm sure you see the problem now. There are a couple of ways this could have been better. Obviously, one solution is to actually write a falling out that sells Anna's eventual isolation. Another, less obvious solution is to resolve this conflict before the inciting incident because, as it stands in the final version, it's just a B-plot that gets forgotten about in favor of the A-plot. Believe it or not, a cut sequence where this exact thing happens actually exists. It comes with its own song and has a characterization of the couple that is much stronger than it is in the final film. Of course, this isn't a full solution. If this conflict was resolved before the inciting incident, Kristoff would still need something to do in the story, or else his presence would run the risk of being redundant. But at the very least, it's a version that's preferable considering he would have an arc that naturally resolves. Moving on, the sisters and Olaf come across a wrecked ship and recognize it as their parents' ship that sank from the first movie. Anna finds a note and a map in a secret compartment, which shows that her and Elsa's parents planned on going north across the Dark Sea to the source of Elsa's powers, Holland, which had previously been referred to as a mythic place told in children's stories.
Only Holland knows.
This revelation causes Elsa to create a freeze frame of the past to confirm that the parents did indeed die because of this trip, which creates more friction between the sisters, and ends with Elsa separating from Anna and Olaf by throwing them down a hill in an ice canoe. And while I've been critical of the sisters' friction in other parts of the plot, I do think that this scene is good. It builds on the grief the sisters felt about losing their parents in the first movie and is able to sell the idea that maybe this journey is actually pretty dangerous. We don't run into the problem of getting told that a spirit is threatening versus it being tamed in a couple of minutes. This scene communicates that the Dark Sea is dangerous because we see the cost, and it's a cost that's very personal to the characters. Really, it's everything that the spirits could have been. When Anna and Olaf end up floating down a river, Olaf tells Anna about his discomfort over so many things changing so quickly. Accepting that things change irreparably is Olaf's arc, and this is something that genuinely works for the most part. Since his first appearance in the film, he's been wondering about this.
Do you ever worry about the notion that nothing is permanent?
No.
So he has a song about not getting the gravity of the situation, he's naturally horrified looking at a freeze frame of people about to drown, and he's angry when he gets thrown down the hill.
You said some things never change, but since then, everything's done nothing but change.
And then 70 minutes in, when he turns into a pile of snowflakes, he realizes that no matter what changes, love is always consistent. So this is a good and complete arc, it's what it needs to be. The only problem with it is how it meshes with the rest of the story after it's complete, as it feels like a story with an arc about accepting that change is inevitable eventually glosses over it when the time comes in an extremely rushed conclusion which weakens the arc's sentiment as a result, with the biggest changes that come to the status quo feeling almost like footnotes. This is difficult to describe indirectly, so let's go to the conclusion. Anna and Olaf end up in a cave and start wandering around. Meanwhile, Elsa has her battle with the knock. She tames it, finds Atta Holland, and discovers that the voice she was hearing was her mother, both in the past saving her father and her singing the lullaby at the beginning. It turns out that Elsa was the bridge between the elements and the Northuldra people the whole time. After creating a ton of freeze frames, she looks around the events of the past and discovers the wrong that must be righted. The dam her grandfather gifted to the Northuldra people was designed to sabotage their lands and force the people to turn to him for guidance. In a moment of vulnerability, he assassinated the Northuldra tribe's leader and kickstarted the battle at the beginning of the movie. After learning this, Elsa freezes, which is more or less what her mother's lullaby warned her about. Before freezing completely, however, she sends a message to Anna telling her the truth. After learning about the dam's real purpose, Anna understands that the only way to rectify the past is to break the dam, which means that Arendelle would drown as a result. After spotting an exit from the cave, Olaf turns into a pile of snowflakes because of Elsa freezing, and Anna is distraught. But remembering Lieutenant Matthias' advice to do the next right thing, she gets up with new resolve, wakes up the Earth Giants, has Kristoff help her get to the dam, convince Matthias and like 5 troops to help break it. They all succeed, Elsa unfreezes, and despite being further away from Arendelle than anyone else, she manages to stop it from drowning. Alright. Olaf gets revived because water has memory, Kristoff proposes, Elsa has Anna take over her role as queen after Honeymaren suggests that she belongs with them, and an Arendelle Northuldra statue is unveiled in town. Elsa still visits on weekends, the end. Alright, so we've already alluded to and even covered some of the problems within the last 30 minutes, but these events feel baffling to watch. This is because aspects of the story either haven't gotten enough spotlight, felt like they were meant to have more gravity, or were even previously intended to be something else entirely. There's a lot that just does not work with the finale, so we may as well start with the underrepresented. I haven't talked about the Northuldra tribe a lot in the plot synopsis, and that's because the story is largely uninterested in their perspective. Now, it's of course not mandatory that every side character have deep involvement in a movie's plot, but the problem with this being the case with the Northuldra tribe is that it turns out a large portion of the story's drama hinges on Arendelle having done acts of colonialism against them. Since they don't get a lot of screen time, the most we learn about the named Northuldra characters are basic character traits. Yelena is the leader, Ryder likes reindeers, and Honeymaren is... I don't know, nice? Yelena is an interesting case because she strangely has the least to contribute to anything at all despite having been in the battle at the beginning of the movie. Even stranger, she also doesn't ask why Iduna left even though her kids show up. The indigenous characters in a story that ends up having a lot to do with colonialism barely have anything to contribute to the characters' arcs or the story at large, and by the end they aren't really relevant. And no, Ryder workshopping Kristoff's proposal does not count. It's disappointing, because conceptually, there are some genuinely great things with this storyline, and not all the execution is bad either. The idea that these royals learned that their lives were built on privileges that involved their own family slaughtering an indigenous tribe that did nothing wrong, and that the only way to fix it is potentially losing the only home they've ever known, is actually very interesting in the abstract. But when the perspectives on that story are so one-sided that the most substantive thing the oppressed indigenous tribe says when they finally become free is, "Whoa, nice," it gives off the impression that they were either an afterthought or had diminishing presence in the story as production went on. Either way, it means their parts of the story and the final product are dreadfully undercooked at best. Well, how about that? We've reached the most contentious moment of the movie. You know, for all the problems I was having while watching this film for the first time, I remember being genuinely pleasantly surprised that it looked like the story was going to destroy Arendelle.
But Arendelle will be flooded.
I thought it was so gutsy. Cut to 5 minutes later though, and it's like... Okay, so, along with the last act or so being an ever-increasing conga line of things that don't quite work, this moment in particular is a standout among detractors, including myself. Why is this moment so hated? Well, I think it's a mix of two reasons, and we'll start with the more commonly stated one. So I mostly hear that Elsa stopping Arendelle from drowning is an ideological failure in the writing, and it is, but not for the reasons most often associated. And yes, I'm about to go to bat for this decision. Kind of. While I don't disagree that a story with this setup can achieve narrative catharsis, I don't think this would have quite worked in Frozen 2 because it very clearly had different priorities, and destroying Arendelle would have felt more like jamming the square peg into the round hole. I think I understand where the sentiment comes from though, because Elsa completely blocking the wave and the movie sprinting as fast as it can to its conclusion feels like a slapdash way of supporting the status quo, like the film got cold feet at the last minute. But pitching the progressive solution to colonialism as effectively nuking the whole place and starting over would, and I mean this charitably, be a tough sell, because without the ideological or narrative intent present to commit to a choice like that, it would just be a much bleaker proposition than a version where a society understands its past wrongdoings and learns from them. That being said, if the biggest parts of the status quo are to be more or less kept, then it's now in the writing to demonstrate Arendelle's growth and how it is now less hostile towards the Northuldra people. The statue is an attempt at this, but it would have been a lot stronger if it was contrasting old ways that Arendelle either respected colonialist grandpa or implicitly participated in Northuldra suppression. Like, on the most surface level, maybe this statue could have replaced a statue of Runerd, or digging deeper, a law that suppressed Northuldrans in some way could have been established at the beginning before getting replaced at the end, or something. Elsa living in Northuldra is alright, I guess, but I'm not entirely sure what her role is. Honeymaren says she belongs with them, and she just kind of goes. Like I said earlier, since all of this happens so quickly, it's hard to get a grip on the magnitude of what's changed because it's all barely illustrated. It's also why both Elsa and Anna's arcs feel adequate if you were to describe them to someone, but come off as flat in their execution despite being technically functional. So the real problem with the ending from an ideological perspective isn't this moment, it's the lack of exploration in this moment.
You know, you belong up here.
And this moment.
Queen Anna of Arendelle.
And this moment. Why the wave blocking moment in particular doesn't work is honestly a lot simpler to describe because this goes back to the classic screenwriting method of setup and payoff. So, Pobby talks about his premonition at the beginning where he says,
Arendelle is not safe. The truth must be found. Without it, I see no future.
This is, as we've already covered, not reinforced by the story. A truthless Arendelle was not only never demonstrated to be appreciably unsafe by the
angry magical spirits
past the 20-minute mark, but also because there's no tangible existential threat to the kingdom until the very end. And it turns out what was required to put Arendelle in peril was the truth.
That's why everyone was forced out. To protect them from what has to be done.
When the truth is in Anna's hands, drowning the kingdom is framed not as an obstacle that must be overcome, but as an inevitability. And it's laid on very, very thick.
When it's clear that everything will never be the same
And then it's like, nope. The premonition not being supported by the rest of the story and the flooding being treated as an inevitability do not mesh with Elsa stopping the tidal wave at the end, because stopping the tidal wave was not sufficiently built up to, it just happens, which is why it comes off like a writing cop-out. It's a payoff that has a different setup, and as a result the story arc is bad and unsatisfying. And that's unfortunate, because with a rewrite this sequence could have probably been one of the strongest endings to a Disney movie. It just leaves you feeling like there must have been a better way to do this whole thing.
And you're right.
Do you remember when I brought up the cut song while talking about Kristoff? Well, it's time to strap in, because there is a lot of cut content in Frozen 2. Movies cutting stuff out and changing plans is a practice as old as the medium and a completely natural part of the process. But a lot of this cut content is really interesting, because if some of it was kept and slightly reworked, I'd argue that Frozen 2 would have been one of the best things Disney has made in the last decade, no exaggeration. Not all of the cut scenes are good, one or two of them are actually quite bad, but the good ones make some of the characters so much more interesting, complete arcs, or sufficiently defined aspects of the story that are so much worse in the final product, it feels like night and day. So before we wrap up, let's discuss the best ones in no particular order. I've already mentioned Kristoff's cut song, Get This Right. It includes a much better characterization of Anna and Kristoff's relationship and sets up an arc about Kristoff's difficulty in fitting into the royal lifestyle. It's a shame it was deleted, because that hang-up could have been expanded upon to create actual friction between the couple. In the knock test, we get just that. An aspect of the knock that gets cut in the final version is that it can feel if you have lies in your heart and will try to drown you if you do. Through this, Kristoff is forced to tell Anna that he doesn't really like his life in Arendelle because of the huge lifestyle change that's come with it.
I don't think we should get married.
Wow, an actual falling out that would have required a resolution? It's like I'm watching two different movies. This scene could have used a little tightening up. At 3.5 minutes, it goes on a bit long, but it certainly isn't bad, and it's preferable for reasons that should be obvious by now. It's not as weird of a situation as the cut prologue scene, where Matthias is actually a character, and we learn how the girl's mother was separated from her tribe. This one is more understandable as to why it was cut, though. If you want to use this sequence as a bedtime story framing device, then you can establish the elemental spirits as well as Atta Holland quicker than in the Enmedea's Res version. It just came at the cost of a character being interesting and a really important plot point making sense, so the prologue probably could have used more work in general. It isn't a clear-cut matter like the Secret Room, something that absolutely should have been kept because Northuldrian is established as a forbidden language.
Northuldrian? But that language is forbidden. Why would Mother know it?
Not only are the parents' motivation to go to Atta Holland more interesting because it's something they felt the need to hide away, the systemic oppression of the Northuldrans is more tangible, and it's something that would have made the ending sequence more meaningful if it was kept. I feel similarly about Home, the song that was cut and replaced with Some Things Never Change. Anna's feelings about Arendelle and wanting to do better for its people are a great setup for her becoming queen at the end, and talking about how much she loves her family would have made good symmetry for her singing The Next Right Thing at the end of Act 2 when she's supposed to be completely isolated. Not to mention, it would have complemented Elsa's Into the Unknown better, as the contrast in the sisters' emotional states at the beginning of the story would have been more clearly illustrated. Oh look, there's a statue of Runar that the one at the end could have replaced. I've seen among detractors to this cut song that Some Things Never Change is a preferable choice because it shows off what all of the main cast is up to. And while that might be true, I'd still argue that song fails to set up what Home is able to regarding Anna's character arc. Without it, her conclusion feels less deliberate. There's also the fact that one of the arcs that Some Things Never Change sets up is straight up forgotten about, but that's less on the song itself and more that the final product is just, you know, written poorly.
Guys, we need to keep moving. I'm supposed to ride a water horse to an ice island to free a fire spirit or something. I think the plot of this movie might be really bad.
But I digress. Home is just better from both an ideological and screenwriting point of view. Speaking of both those things, the last cutscene is one from the ending sequence and takes place after the tidal wave. In this version, Elsa still saves Arendelle, but not all of it. The castle gets destroyed, and Anna says this.
We'll rebuild the castle. New. No secrets. No deceit. New rules, even.
That right there just shows you how much potential this ending sequence had. It's probably the most potential that was wasted out of all of these scenes. Anna also gets closure about the fate of her parents that arguably only Elsa got in the final version. Elsa's decision to abdicate the throne is explored a bit, and while that could still stand to be elaborated on even more, it's definitely an improvement, if only a small one. Like The Secret Room, this absolutely should not have been cut. And that's what gets me. Frozen 2 is probably the most interesting Disney movie released in the last 5 or so years to talk about, but I'm unsure if that's because of its content or because of how much it could have been improved. It's not all bad, but what was cut could have no doubt made a better movie if it was implemented correctly, and it reeks of a troubled production. Whether it's watching the cut content or the theatrical release, there's just a feeling you get after you're done with either that Frozen 2 could have, been less shitty. And by less shitty, I mean it could have been excellent. Maybe it was a result of brand restrictions, a result of changing plans, overambition that led to clutter, or harsh deadlines. But whatever the biggest difficulty encountered during production was, it culminated in a bloated movie with an undercooked story that was too unsure on how to act on its biggest ideas, leaving some of its best parts on the cutting room floor.
No, we're done.
Hi, thanks for watching my video where I spoke about how much I didn't like Frozen 2 for half an hour. I thought it was going to be finished in May, but it's August, so that's pretty sick. I don't have anything to promote since this is the first video on this channel. Yeah, I'm going to go play FF14. Good night.